Good morning. My name is Gustavo Dominguez, and it is a pleasure to introduce this morning's the international guest speaker. Since 2012, Nathalie Cely has served as the Ecuadorian ambassador to the United States. She's a passionate advocate for Ecuador here in this country and brings with her great passion, energy, compassion, and a deep personal drive that is unmatched. Her strong commitment to her job and country is seen each and every day by those who work with her at the embassy and in the Washington diplomatic community. She is constantly working on issues important to Ecuador and truly embodies all of the characteristics that a public servant should have. And I know she's working constantly. I have had the privilege to work for her at the embassy in Washington, and trust me, I am used to getting emails and phone calls from her at all hours of the day and night. Ambassador Cely is actually an economist by trade, and she holds many important positions back in Ecuador. From May 2009 until November 2011, she was the coordinating Minister of Production, Employment, and Competitiveness. That's a very hard word even in Spanish, I'm sorry. Before that, she served as coordinating Minister of Social Development. Ambassador Cely champions socioeconomic inclusion policies aimed at integrating training, technological transfers, and access to markets to reduce poverty and inequality, enhancing the lives of thousands of Ecuadorians. She earned her degree in economics from the Catholic University of Guayaquil, and later a master's in public administration and a diploma in public and social policy at Harvard University John Kennedy School of Government. She's here today to talk about a subject that is near and dear to her heart and to the heart of all Ecuadorians, environmental justice. And please, listen clearly to what she has to say. We believe there are ways we can encourage foreign investment, but also protect our environment. Ambassador Cely will tell you Ecuador's story, and that we can all learn from with a hope for a bright future. Without question, this is an exciting time for Ecuador and our relationship with the United States. We are the fastest growing location for Americans to retire to, and we just recently launched a tourism campaign called All You Need is Ecuador. This actually makes me think of something as I think about Ambassador Cely's distinguished background and the importance of finding ways to improve relations with the United States. The phrase, all you need is Nathalie, immediately comes to my mind. But seriously, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Nathalie Cely.
Buenos dias. Good morning. Thank you, Gustavo, for such generous words. I'm really happy and delighted to be here and getting away of Washington. I told a couple of you that I miss being at university. One of the things that I miss the most for my times before starting to work with this current government 7 years ago is being able to interact with young people, people committed, people with a lot of ideals and optimism about how to change and transform the world. I miss dearly when I used to teach several universities in Quito, and I certainly look forward when I go back to do that again. It's been a wonderful pleasure for me to be at the home of the Blue Devils. I hope everyone has recovered from the unfortunate early loss in the NCAA tournament. I encourage you, though, to look at the bright side. Back in D.C., everyone is complaining that Georgetown didn't even make to the tournament. So, it's always a bright side in everything. What I want to talk to you about today are the challenges facing the whole world as we struggle to find a balance between developing our societies and taking care of the needs of our people on one hand, and protecting our environment and developing sustainable and with an eye towards the long term on the other hand. I hope the experiences of Ecuador and how we are learning to find the right balance can shed some light on this struggle for everyone. Ecuador is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. We are home to the Galapagos Islands, the Amazon rainforest, the Andean mountains, and long coastal stretches. Our location by the equator, coupled with the Andean mountains, make our climate especially fertile for all forms of flora and fauna. We have been identified as one of the 17 most biodiverse countries in the world. Only one of our national parks in the Amazon rainforest has more species, frogs, toads, and trees than the entire continental US and Canada put them together. In 2008, the people of Ecuador ratified the first national constitution in the world to enshrine the rights of nature. This was more than a symbolic gesture. It reflected a national consensus that our whole approach to protecting the environment, including ourselves, must change and adapt if we're going to make this planet a place where all can live freely and safely. However, we did not arrive at this conclusion easily. The path to get where we are today was long, litigious, and costly in so many levels. To fully understand what led Ecuador to become the first country to adopt the rights of nature in its constitution, it's necessary to understand the country's complicated history with oil, which has been both a blessing and a curse. For decades, transnational corporations took advantage of our national institutional weakness, and we already have discussed about that, how important it is to have the knowledge, how important it is to have the right standards, the regulation in place. And thank you, Daniel, for the question you asked at the end of the first panel, because it's very related to what I'm talking here today. So that our country institutional weakness back there in 1960, when oil was found, as is related to the public sector and lacks international standards for business compliant with human rights, protections, and regulation. Irresponsible extraction of natural resources, inadequate methods of remediation, and lack of financial compensation for victims or corporate responsibility harm not only human life, but also the environment. Arguably, the most egregious example is that of Texaco Chevron, almost 25 operations in Ecuador. Since 1964, by then, my country was very poor and undeveloped. We have made a long way since that, and I will tell you a bit about that too. But that was the state of affairs when Texaco was part of the consortium of oil companies and was the sole operator with exclusive responsibility for exploring, extracting, and managing the oil operations in our Amazon rainforest. Texaco, which later to merge with Chevron in 2001, operating in Ecuador using methods and technology that were obsolete and not environmentally friendly, contrary to the technologies used by the same company in other parts of the world at the same time, just the issue, Daniel, you raised. Lack of experience, weak institutions, and the absence of international obligations mandating minimum compliance requirements in hydrocarbon exploitation made Ecuador deeply dependent on external technology expertise. The design and construction of infrastructure, what will facilitate the exploration, extraction, transportation, and sale of Ecuadorian oil on the global market, in addition to remediation practices, require this external expertise and subsequent transfer of knowledge. These provide considerable advantage for transnational companies over the state during what was initially referred as the oil boom. These legal, technical, operational, and administrative advantages made the country totally dependent on large transnational corporations. Oil companies ostensibly took advantage of this relationship dynamic. As I said before, TexPet operated all 356 wells that were drilled, and it's estimated that more than 800 pits were excavated to vary the sludge and contaminated material produced in the drilling process. Millions of gallons of wastewater and produced water were dumped into the rivers proximate to the oil well operations. Ecuador's relationship with Texaco provides many lessons for Ecuador and the world in a number of different fields, particularly in human rights, environmental policy, investment treaties, international relations, business ethics, and international arbitration. Texaco used in Ecuador a remediation system much different than the one used in the United States, where it has to adhere to rules and standards for business compliant with human rights, health, and environmental protections. During the period when Texaco was responsible for oil exploration and exploitation, it not only ignored the American Petroleum Institute extensive guidelines and recommended techniques for remediation issued in 1963, but it also failed to use the remediation system the company itself had patented and which was considered the last technology at that time. When Texaco left Ecuador, it left unprecedented damage to the environment and no compensation to those affected in its wake. For more than a decade, a group of indigenous plantees from the affected rainforest were embroiled in a legal battle with Texaco Chevron. Despite a legal labyrinth that stretches from Ecuador to New York to California, back to Ecuador, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, and even The Hague, Chevron still refuses to pay the remediation and is continuously seeking legal refuges to avoid assuming responsibility. Instead, Chevron has waged a dangerous and unprecedented international campaign to escape responsibility, including filing 3 arbitration proceedings against the government of Ecuador and undermining both Ecuadorian-U.S. bilateral relationships and the international investment treaty framework. For example, it's possible to prove through documents obtained thanks to the Freedom of Information Act the extent and force of Chevron's lobbying and public relations effort to exert pressure on United States government institutions with the purpose of influence, from human rights reports to the commercial relationships between the two countries. Chevron has lobbied the U.S. government to end key trade programs with Ecuador, such as the Andean Trade Promotion and Drug Eradication Act, named as ATPDA, and Ecuador's status under the Generalized System of Preference, GSP. These programs are wholly unrelated to Chevron's lawsuit. In fact, they have received a strong bipartisan support in the U.S. for more than 2 decades because they provide economic opportunities both to poor families in Ecuador and to small business in the United States. And this is also an issue very close to my heart, because what we want for poor people in Ecuador is dignity. We want for poor people in Ecuador is the opportunity to work and to have market access for those goods that they crave. And also it has an impact in our relationship because, as you might know, Ecuador, we do not produce drugs. We are between Colombia and Peru, dear countries. We share values. We really, are brothers and sisters. But among them, they produce the largest amount of cocaine in the world. And we are a transit country. And we have managed to not produce drugs. And in fact, we have beautiful rose farms in the northern part of Ecuador that serve as a buffer to Colombia. And you might see those roses here because one out of 4 roses coming here from Ecuadorians. But roses are suffering because of this. And beyond that, half of the employment generated by the industry is women. And I'm really an advocate of women freedom, and that comes from the ability to be economic independent. And that's why, for me, this has become personal in a sense. Yet Chevron directly and through business associations it supports financially has waged a massive campaign with the goal of coercing the government of Ecuador to suspend due process and interfere in the civil lawsuit between Chevron and the indigenous plaintiffs, which they lost. This lobbying effort has been detrimental to the bilateral relationship between the United States and Ecuador. Ecuador has grown and learned much from this experience. We have set out on an irreversible path towards a stronger and more inclusive democracy with solid institutions that protect all, including vulnerable indigenous population and the natural environment. Where the international community has lagged, we have stepped up and created our own framework to protect our environment and set the standards for responsible and sustainable economic growth and development. One of the main lessons that Ecuador learned from the Chevron case is that the country suffered from a weak regulatory government system and the lack of political will in that time to address these issues. And not addressing those issues in a timely manner, as also we have learned today, can be also very harmful to the environment and communities. There was also a lack of the conceptual framework for evaluating investments in the natural resource sectors of the country. Our current political, economic, and judicial reform initiatives led by President Correa are aiming at correcting this weakness. How have these changes been implemented? The policies of the 20th century left Ecuador in a precarious and unsustainable position by the early 2000s. Poverty was high, infrastructure was old and failing, and the social safety net for citizens was minimal and not inclusive. Ecuador needed drastic structural changes, strong leadership, and deep and sustainable reform to modernize its economy, society, and democracy. With this in mind, November 2006, the people of Ecuador elected economist Rafael Correa as President of the Republic of Ecuador. His message of change and support for health, education, employment, housing initiatives, essentially the creation of a new country for everybody, for all, resonated deeply among Ecuadorians. Upon first taking office, President Correa proposed to convene an assembly to write a new constitution, a proposal that was overwhelmingly supported for international referendum. A constituency assembly was convened and it approved a draft text for a new constitution. The proposed constitution was then put to popular referendum and won the support of the Ecuadorian people with 2/3 of the national popular vote. This new constitution, adopted in 2008, was the first in the world to establish the rights of nature. The constitution also has several articles related to the management of the incomes for natural resources. First, it established environmental protection as a priority. Second, it also established that from that income, there are set funding assigned to determined sectors such as health, education, research, science, and technology innovation, among others. Let me tell you another personal story. When I was the Minister of Social Development, I went with the President to fly over the rainforest. I mean, this is back in 2007, the first three months of the government. And when we land, and I was looking at the map, and I say, how can it be that the poorest provinces, that the poorest town in my country are the towns where all this wealth has been taken? I mean, how is that possible that, besides the environmental damage, not even, the benefits of all these resources have been really invested in them? And that was really a huge change that we did. The way that the resources of any natural resources is distributed. And now we have a fund that goes directly to the local government, and the local people has a say in how they want the money to be invested. So that I think also makes a whole difference in about how you redistribute the benefits of natural resource exploitation. The inclusion of the rights of nature constitution has received a tremendous response within Ecuador. Between 2008 and 2013, the National Judicial Council recorded 1,164 cases filed in connection with crimes against nature. The latest 2013 figures show that 570 cases, of which 278 have been resolved. The international community took notice of Ecuador's stand to protect the rights of nature and the importance of enshrining the commitment to environmental protection in law. Since 2008, Bolivia, Turkey, Nepal, and New Zealand, as well as various U.S. municipalities in Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and California, had written protections of nature and the environment into their constitutions and local ordinances. At the present time, Ecuador is confronted with the need to bring to conclusions two fundamental processes to make sure that our comprehensive development policies can be implemented successfully. The first is to improve a state regulatory system, to build pathways to allow further technological development, investing in human talent, and strengthening the research capacity needed to change our production and energy matrices. Ecuador has undertaken a thorough reform of higher education and educational restructuring in order to promote the formation of advanced human talent and the development of research, innovation, and technology transfer. As a matter of fact, we have a program called Excellency, and where we committed to students that get into the top university of the world, they can get full scholarship. We have take aside windfalls from oil for that purpose. 3,000 students just in the last 3 years have come to the United States to top universities such as Duke to get their undergraduate, master's degrees, and PhD studies. The second process, just as important as the first, is that we must accelerate and consolidate the transformation of the Ecuadorian judicial system. Definitely, there's no such development without true justice, and I believe truly that there's no true freedom also without justice. Redoubling efforts to achieve reforms, approving a popular referendum in May of 2011. As a mandatory result of this referendum, the government of Ecuador has undertaken the process of transformation and reorganization of the Ecuadorian judicial system with a strategic plan centered around the modernization of justice that includes ensuring transparency and quality in the provision of justice by developing and strengthening the oral proceedings, improving systems and alternatives to detention, and the creation of monitoring units for hearings. Also providing optimal access to justice and fostering continued improvement and modernization of service through the development and strengthening of a national mediation system, the decentralization of justice service, and the efficiency and effectiveness of judicial proceedings. Institutionalizing a meritocracy system in the judiciary through establishing higher professional ethic standards. By implementing this reform, Ecuador seeks to provide an attractive environment for international investment that respects all of our principles as well as fair economic aspirations. However, Ecuador cannot and should not pave the way to fuller promotion of sustainability and corporate responsibility alone. Our country efforts alone cannot sufficiently address the need to transform investment treaties and arbitration mechanisms for sustainable development and productive transformation. That is why we seek to bring together stakeholders from around the world, including the United Nations, other concerned countries from our region, as well as Europe, Africa, Asia, and key civil society voices in order to establish a global set of fair minimum standards and regulations that will hold transnational corporations accountable when they invest, and obtain reasonable profits. We aim to place the promotion of social and environmental justice on an equal footing with corporate profits. Sometimes Ecuador is portrayed in the press as a socialist country that don't want to, even a non-market economy that don't want to foster investors. I'm here to tell you that's not the truth. We truly believe in the role of the private sector is the true engine of growth, as our Constitution and as the production law that when I was minister helped to establish, it's really there. What we believe is that you need to find a balance between government and regulation and the state role, of course, in maximizing the profits of the exploitation of our national resource to put at the service of people. But that doesn't make us a no-market economy. That doesn't make us as anti-business. That doesn't make us anti-transnational. We welcome them. As a matter of fact, Coca-Cola, that can be such a controversial company too, just announced an investment of $1 billion in my country in the following 2 years. And that has been the rhetoric here in the way that Ecuador is being portrayed, and our voice hasn't been loud and enough because of those reasons, and that's why we believe Ecuador cannot do this alone. Through this process, Ecuador has also learned that bilateral investment treaties and the arbitration framework around them must be reformed. The government of Ecuador fully supports the principle that all investment risks should be properly rewarded. But under the current bilateral investment treaty system, conditions indiscriminately favor corporate and commercial interests over human rights, rights of nature, and country sovereignty. Countries like Ecuador must balance these commercial interests with public policy objectives that seek to protect all the principles that must be upheld for investors as well for citizens who should benefit from this economic investment. Ecuador believes that balancing its principles and treaty obligation is ultimately possible and demonstrated this commitment in late 2013 when it presented the Joint Declaration on Transnational Corporations and Human Rights before the 24th Ordinary Session of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. The declaration, signed by 85 countries, seeks to create binding international law to ensure that the powers of transnational companies are subject to the scrutiny of monitoring and promoting human rights in the country where they do business. This first step represents significant progress to establish minimal standards of corporate ethics for transnational investors and respect for human rights, which signatory states are obligated to protect. Ecuador has charted a difficult course, but one that is necessary and mindful of the complexity of our goals, building our country, economy, and investment environment, and elevating the quality of life of our citizens, all while holding as equally important our duty to be the best steward we can be on the earth and the space we have been given. We intend to prove through our example that profitable and responsible are not mutually exclusive, and the first fruits of these efforts are beginning to show. The hard lessons we learn in Ecuador must not be forgotten. They are instructed to every country in every region of the world. We must move forward with a commitment and with a regulatory and legal framework that's suited for the 21st century progress. The international community, members, large and small, must change the way that corporate social responsibility is measured. It must include provisions that value human rights and environmental protections equally with profits, or that measure with Ramon flow. Those who do not learn from history will be doomed to repeat it, and we, Ecuador, working with the international community, cannot let this come to pass. Thank you very much for the opportunity today to speak to all of you, and I hope that one day I can welcome every one of you to my beautiful country, Ecuador, who is committed to progress, equality, and prosperity. And I'm so looking forward for any question that you might have. Thank you.
So we have time for a good number of questions, actually.
So I know in a lot of countries, I don't know if this is the case in Ecuador, you know, the transnational companies are responsible for environmental damage, but the local, state-run national oil companies are often just as bad. What is their track record in Ecuador, and also what type of protections are there against environmental damage by state-run national oil companies as opposed to transnational ones?
Well, you're totally right. I mean, the law is for every company. It shouldn't matter if it's a national-run state company or it's a transnational company. And in the regard of our oil company, just recently, I would say 10 years ago, they start to operate it by themselves. I mean, finally, we have the technology and the knowledge to do it by ourselves in several fields in Ecuador. Our previous history has been of delegating, actually not even delegated, to sharing the ownership of a company in order to exploit those resources. But I think it's something that we are we're trying to change right now is the way that you to avoid the problem of of public interference, when you have a state-owned company, is to separate policymaking from regulation and from control. In the past, policymaking and regulation was in one body. And just recently, we have a Minister of Environment. We didn't have a Minister of Environment since, only 10 years ago. And now what this government is proposing in a new environmental code law that's going to be sent to the National Assembly in the following months is to separate policymaking from regulation and having an independent from the government environmental superintendency that will be the one that will implement all the mandatory regulation. In that sense, you will create something that it's would try to create something that is not influenced by political influence, and in that sense, having to have more protection in place. Regarding the track record of we have three Ecuadorian oil companies, Petroecuador and Petroamazonas. I would say that Petroamazonas is a new one, and we are trying to also develop partnerships with top institutions and universities all over the world to have the knowledge and the expertise. I would say it's mixed. It's mixed. If you go if you go to the last 5 years, I would say it's better. It's getting better, and we are acknowledging that and making sure that we put all the regulation, as I say, and also. What it's new also in Ecuador is awareness of people. It's this national sense that we need to protect what we have, and I think we have been kind of good at doing that. For example, the Galapagos Island is a good it's a good example of how we have been able to protect the islands. But of course, there's always room to do more, and I learned a lot today, and looking forward to learn more.
So I'm very, I'm very interested in the development of renewable energy technologies, and you were mentioning the problems that Ecuador has faced with the oil and gas boom by having foreign multinational corporations sort of capture the government of Ecuador and be able to dictate policy. When Ecuador makes this next step into developing renewable technologies, what safeguards do you feel need to be in place to avoid, making the same mistakes and allowing companies to dictate what goes down and what happens, and have Ecuador be able to control their clean energy future?
All right. So first of all, we are trying to implement a new model where you are trying to walk away from the dependence on oil. And I think that's important to highlight. I mean, the less dependence that we have, the better. And we are working in that with a combination of investing in human talent, having a modernized industrial policy, trade policy, and investment promotion policy. Regarding to the particular issue that you are mentioning about how we are safeguarding from future exploitation, I think it's in a fourfold fashion. First of all, as I say, having the policymaking, regulation, and control in different bodies and trying to encapsulate them from political interference and political influence. Secondly, also, it's a process where you get to exploit, well, you include community participation. And third, I would say, is trying to have as much knowledge as possible. And I think this is so key to everything that we're doing here. And trying to get that knowledge, we're doing three things. First of all, we're training our top mind students in the top universities in the world. And we are providing full scholarship. Of course, they need to come back and work in Ecuador for a certain amount of time. And secondly, we just launched a new university, a new research park that's called Yachay. It means knowledge city in the northern part of my country. It just opened the doors last Monday. And Yachay, we are having a lot of work together with institutions in the United States. For example, we're working with Yale. We're looking forward to work with the Air Institute of Colombia too, and other many institutions, in order to have the knowledge, in order to come with a framework that would allow to analyze investment coming in my country for very different views and different criteria that not contemplate only the traditional ones, right? The return on investment, but particularly being able to analyze the technology and having the proper standards for the use. And finally, and no less important, as I mentioned, the national awareness on this and creating the right mechanisms so people can, and communities can express their concerns.
Can you describe, just give some concrete examples of what crimes against nature are and how that interacts with personal property rights?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I can provide you some examples of those crimes. For example, in Quito, in the capital of the city, we have some problems with fires, that were intentional, and some of them were not intentional, but not having, I guess, a most conscious behavior. I mean, in a sense, I mean, you are not doing that on purpose, but you are causing a damage. And there was an incident that it really was taken as a symbol of this, and we have a case of against the people that were found responsible for provoking a fire that consumed a very important rainforest surrounding Quito, and that caused other several different consequences. In the past, we could not prosecute that because that wasn't classified or in the law as something that it was subject to civil or criminal law.
Seeing as in Yosemite National Park, there are indigenous peoples there, and they, I guess, prefer to be left alone. How does the Ecuadorian government take their interests into account when trying to come up with a drilling policy in that area?
It is a very sensitive issue, trying to find the balance, and actually we now are facing a very, very conundrum issue in Ecuador. I don't know if you know this, but about 5 years ago, we proposed to the world a new mechanism why, when you don't drill and when you don't have emissions, CO2, in a sense, in a place such a pristine as a rainforest, as for example, the Yasuni Park, you can argue that you are creating a global public good in the sense that it affects everybody, not only because of the environment, because of the species, and that they're unique there. So in a sense, we like to think it's not only Ecuadorians; it's the world's a treasure. So we propose to a concept that is a net avoided emission, and we will try to. Ecuador will commit to not exploit the oil in the Yasuni area and to put half of the revenues that we might have if we go along with the exploration. And the world would come up with the other half. We will do a fund through United Nations to invest in renewable energies and others. And I'm going to talk a little bit about renewable energies because we changed our matrix of energy totally by 2016. But anyway, so the initiative didn't fly. I guess the world was facing a planetary crisis in 2008. And as my son sometimes tells me, Mom, it's so difficult to sell. You're trying to sell oxygen to the world. It's free. Why people will pay for it? I mean, that was kind of the concept that we were trying to do, and it didn't work well. So now the government decided that we will exploit 1%, less than 1% of the Yasuni area. And for example, now the citizens of Ecuador has the opportunity to join or to accumulate 600,000 signatures in order to have a national referendum. If you get to, that's a democratic mechanism that we have in our Constitution, that if you can get the 600,000 signatures, you can call it to a national referendum. So the deadline for that is April 30, and if the 600,000 signatures are collected, the government will need to make a national referendum to us. So we have all these provisions in our new Constitution. And for matters such as dear to our heart, as the exploration of the Yasuni. And you have others for local community by law, oral laws, it requires not only environmental studies being conducted by the Ministry of Environment, but also you need to conduct a public, transparent, of a reaching dialogue with the communities where the projects are going to be built.
I just wanted to ask a question relative to what you mentioned earlier about the human rights part and international, a global set of laws, I think, paraphrasing what you said. How you think the international laws and human rights laws are going to work with state, Ecuador's policies and regulations to ensure that the public interest and the environment that the public lives in is protected. I mean, of course, we discussed earlier this morning that we have a lot of policies in the United States that you may not have in Ecuador as yet, but people still are here saying that human rights is a way to address some of the issues that we deal with, because our constitutional laws aren't as effective as they should be in the United States.
Well, this is a very complicated issue. For example, Ecuador has signed every single human rights treaty in the world. United States has not, and other countries in the world has not either. So that makes a global system a little bit complicated, to tell the truth. So what we need to do, and what I think we need to find, is a way where this goodwilling of all these countries that signed this declaration on United Nations, looking for international to commit to minimum standards for human rights protections, move forward, and that requires political will. And then, I'm really sorry, it requires political will of countries in the world to take this issue as important and take this issue as something that it's worth to fight and come out. So what we envision is moving forward from that declaration to find some ways of making this happen, as hard as it is, since, not even the human rights conventions or treaties or, in issues as so close to the heart of everybody as the children rights have been signed for every country in the world. But that shouldn't refrain us of keep fighting and trying to find for other solutions. And another way of trying to do this is to reform the arbitration system. That's oftentimes, and know that you are law students might know a lot about that too, that oftentimes is also used in behalf of the multinationals. Changing that system in the investor-state related issues is crucial also to try to make the system to work in a more fair basis.
In the final constitution?
Okay, so we have a constitution. We have several constitutions that were revised before the one that we have. What I think is, we had suffered from several crises. We have a huge one in 1998. We have a meltdown when the Niño hit us, and you have the tequila crisis, if you might remember that, and we lost 8% of GDP, and we have a lot of distress, financial bankruptcy and everything. And Ecuador is not any different from other Latin American countries where you have a high inequality distribution, income distribution, and where you have elites. Do you say that word in English? Elites too, right? Elites. We're very, very disconnected from the rest of the country. And, we also have a lack of a state. Remember it was very popular, the less state, it's the better. So it was a very, very difficult time for my country. The poverty were the highest at that time. And we have 1.5 million Ecuadorians that flew out of Ecuador at that time. Many came to the United States and to Spain. So I would say, suffering a lot and being close to facing to a very, very difficult situation makes you reflect. And I guess then having the people aware that you need to change the politics, that you need to change this structurally in order to get better, provide the soil for President Correa with his new vision to be very welcome. And we managed to achieve so many things in the last 7 years that we haven't been able to do in 100 years. And it's not easy to change a constitution of a country. It's not easy to set new rules of the game. It's not easy to try to create opportunities for everybody. And of course, there's a lot of there's a little bit of polarization. But I think more and more the wealthy people in my country are acknowledging that good things are happening too, and we don't have, of course, the polarization that Venezuela has. No way. I mean, we have a middle class that it's booming, and our economy is booming. We don't have any problem. I mean, we're doing fine, and I guess we correct things at a different time than other countries. And I will say we have more common grounds, and more common vision of that this change is needed. So we in the previous years, like 3 or 4 years ago, we experienced some of that. But once people knew that the private property was going to be respected, that the private sector plays an important role, and I always say that Ecuadorian socialist way is a third way in the South. That sometimes in the United States it's really difficult to explain, and things tend to be oversimplified. And Latin American countries are very different one from another.
So yeah, we have time for one more question.
Ecuador, like Bristol Bay in Alaska, is in the pre-extraction phase, or a lot of Ecuador's projects are in the planning phase. What are some arrangements that Ecuador uses or could use to align the interest between the government and the extracting companies so that there isn't environmental damage when they do the extraction, rather than go through litigation where the company drags their feet and it takes years to get any damages? You're
totally right. I mean, preventing is the way of going. Preventing, of course, is effective and less costly in so many levels. And something that we have been working, and I really admire the work that Professor Klein has done at Georgetown, creating this multi-level, variable framework to assess investment. I think is crucial for us. I mean, when you start conversations with foreign companies, I mean, you need to find ways to assess. Of course, to provide a scheme where revenues are well distributed between the state and the risk that company is taking. The technology is another issue that you need to really understand and really make sure that that's the right technology. Providing the legal protection is another issue. having the social implications for communities and getting those worries being taken in consideration in the process, of course, it is important. So I would say we are trying to implement a new framework that wasn't implemented in the past, and bring that framework in our preliminary conversations. And that's what we're trying to do with a new round that is going to be open for small oil exploration, and we have mining too. We have a recent discoveries in the mining sector that of course also is going to be a challenge for that, and that's why we are so keen in investing and promoting tourism, because we think we want to move away from the dependence on this type of industries where finding the balance is always tricky.
Well, if everyone will join me thanking the ambassador, that was quite wonderful.
Thank you very much.
So now we're going to break for lunch, and if everyone could.